The Chalke History Festival special series on history with Jackson. Hello and welcome to History Jackson, the home of accessible and digestible history. And welcome to our Chalke History Festival special series, where we'll be talking to some of the historians, living historians and performers here at Chalke about what they're doing at the festival and their work. Now, Chalke History Festival will be covered comprehensively through History Jackson, be it on our social media, our blog, and our podcast. So if you wanted to check out more and learn more about what's happening at Chalke, do head to the links in the description below. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you to our Chalke History Festival special series episode. So hello and welcome to the Chalke History Festival special series here on History Jackson, and we're joined by David Horspool. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on, Jackson.
No worries. Thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. I'm really excited to talk about what you're doing here today at Chalke because I love sport. And I love any opportunity to talk about sport on the podcast.
Excellent. Well, I'm the author of a book called More Than a Game, A History of How Britain Made Sport. And it really looks at the effects that sport have had on Britain and that Britain has had on sport from a very long time ago to almost the present day. And I've just been discussing that at the Chalke Festival here across the way.
Oh, I think it's a much needed area of discussion. Of course, I'd say that as a sportsman, but
Absolutely.
Now within your talk, you mentioned the field of the cloth of gold.
Yes.
How, like a lot of the time when we look at this as historians, we see it as a geopolitical Tudor event, but you see it more as a sporting event.
Yeah, I think you have to see it as the two combined, really. What the Field of the Cloth of Gold was, of course, it was a diplomatic meeting between France and Britain, but it was also a huge tournament. That's what they were there to do, was to joust. And jousting was taken very seriously at the time as a way of representing your wealth, your power, your prowess. So the idea that you would turn up and show what a kind of nation you were was a very important part of it. So that's a very early example from 1520 of sport really standing in for a kind of soft power, as we might call it today.
I really find the soft power element of sport incredibly fascinating, and the fact that it's even being used that way in the 16th century.
Yes.
Is there many parallels in how it's being projected as a big event with how it's been done over the last 100, 200 years? Well,
I think so. I think the sport as a mega event kind of came back into popular life really through de Coubertin. Baron de Coubertin was the inventor of the modern Olympic Games. And at about the same time as he was working on that idea, there was a movement in Britain and partially in America to work on a kind of thing which eventually became the Empire Games. It was almost the same time that these ideas started. It was just de Coubertin was much more efficient at actually getting his project off the ground and spreading it. And actually the Brits bought into that. It was an unusual example of the Brits tacking on to an outside influence in our sporting history rather than telling the world what the way is to play sport, which was our usual way of doing things.
And then how we have a lot of national games. There's football, there's rugby, there's cricket. How do we, as a nation, as Britain as a nation, how does it export these games across the world?
Well, one of the main ways in which sport was exported is, of course, through empire. But I think it's important to realise that a lot of those sports that were played around the empire weren't much played with the colonised. So if we take, for example, India, it wasn't until quite late on that English, European, as it was known, teams took on Indian teams in that game. And there was a Parsi team that beat an English team quite early on in the 19th century and set a pattern which we saw repeated 2 days ago of Indians beating England at cricket. So this idea of exporting sport as part of empire. I think it has to be understood also as attracting the people who were colonized to a game and their own decision to take it up or not. And that's why also it happens with football in a kind of much less formal way.
And within your answer there, I'm hearing that there's a lot of division in the way that the sport is being organised, being played. Does the sport in Britain across the empire, does it get separated into, our class system?
Yeah, it certainly does. I think that's absolutely still part of it. I mean, I think it's very much the sporting habits of imperial Britain were mainly the sporting habits of the upper classes. And actually, if you look at someone like right at the top, like the Viceroy Curzon out in India, if you asked him, was he a keen sportsman, he would have said yes, but by that he would have meant he shot a lot of tigers. So there's a kind of different idea of what sport really meant.
And it's interesting to see those divisions on how people see sport and play and choose which sports to play. And an interesting facet of your talk that you mentioned earlier was that different geographic locations tend to play different sports. Different sports emerge in different geographic locations. Why does that happen?
Well, it's difficult to answer that sort of question with complete certainty, but what you can observe, and I particularly refer to the experience of Wales, you can observe that the mining communities and the rugby clubs of Wales kind of almost map onto each other. So Wales is, by some descriptions, the first completely industrialized nation in the world. It was the first nation to have more people working in industry than agriculture. And it's also the heart of rugby union in Britain. And in my book, I discuss whether that's a coincidence or not. And I think it probably isn't a coincidence. There are some things that about the kind of toughness of the mining community and the toughness of rugby that go together very well. And I believe, Jackson, you have more experience of the toughness of rugby than I do.
Very, very through injuries, but less experience in mining, to be honest.
Yeah. I think we both avoided that.
Yeah, soft-handed historians don't do very...
Absolutely not, yeah.
So how come then? How come we have seemed to have been left behind in terms of our sporting achievements in a lot of these sports that we've exported? Rugby, England is the only Northern Hemisphere team to have won the Rugby World Cup. And a lot of ex-colonies and members of the Commonwealth have won more Rugby World Cups than England. The rest of the world has won far more World Cups than England. Yeah. So how has this happened?
Well, I think it's partly just a simple fact of kind of population. And also, I think also that Britain has always, because of its attachment to the origins of all these sports, I think it's always spread itself pretty thin over sport. And that we want to be world champions in football, in rugby, in cricket, in anything we take up, really, and we expect to challenge the world at these things. But, there aren't that many of us.
Yeah.
We don't have limitless sources of wealth. And also, we don't have a climate that's conducive to being outside quite as much as they do in Australia, for example. So all those things kind of combine, and it's the great truth about sport that its popularity will just find its own level in different places, and those are obviously affected by whether you're allowed to play in some countries where sports have been banned over the years, but also what kind of funding there is, and the culture that grows up around it, which is, for example, why South Americans are so good at football, is that they have this very football-obsessed culture. They're not so good at rugby, and they don't play cricket. So that's not quite true to say. They do play cricket a bit in Brazil, I think, but basically they're not interested in those other sports, whereas we spread ourselves pretty thinly.
I certainly agree that we do spread ourselves very thinly, and you see across British sporting history that you tend to have dual code internationals, and that's quite an interesting part of our sporting history.
Yes, absolutely, and that's to do with this whole kind of gentlemen and players, amateur and professional divide that when sport begins to be codified and written down, it's mostly by upper class, public school educated, mostly men. And a lot of the time they want to keep it that way, while at the same time realizing that a sport only played by quote unquote gentlemen isn't going to be much of a sport. There just aren't enough of them about, and they're frankly not good enough at it. So there were always fudges and ways of getting hoi polloi to play sport, but at the same time keeping control of it. And the moments where professional leagues come out and or the whole sport goes professional tend to be times when that attempt of control has ceased to work. It has to face reality, really, of a changing world.
No, I think that's a great point on that sport had to face reality, and it's constantly had to do that. Now, within your research for your book, what was the most interesting anecdote or statistic or fact that you came across?
Oh, that's always an impossible question to answer, isn't it? At the drop of a hat. But I think, well, one of the most sort of affecting stories I kind of learnt about was the story of the great jockey Fred Archer, who was, I think, undoubtedly the most popular man in England in the late 19th century. And he was an absolutely extraordinary sporting genius, really, and rode more winners than anyone else for 8 years running, and very sadly died by his own hand. He shot himself because of the strain he was under. He was rather tall, like Lester Piggott, and he was so strained by his attempts to make the weight constantly that he kind of slightly had a mental breakdown. And he also had a very sad life. But the extraordinary turnout for his funeral, hundreds of thousands of people came to Newmarket for his funeral. The Times ran enormous articles about him. You know, the Times was a very sober, it didn't have kind of sports pages as such, it was a very sober newspaper at the time. But I think that really brought home to me the story of his life, how central sports and different sports over different times have been to our national life.
That's incredibly moving. So thank you very much for bringing that to us. Now, you're here at Chalke History Festival.
Yes.
It is a beautiful day. My eyes are under the strain of the sun. We've had
That's gorgeous.
this medieval band going on throughout the podcast.
Bit of Shawm and so on, yeah.
So what are you most looking forward to looking at today at the festival?
Well, I think I'm still going to be in time to see William Dalrymple. So if I am, I hope so. I've already seen James Holland and co talking about Stalin. But there's just so much here. My family are here, and you know, there's planes flying over, there's artillery going off, there's people dressed as everything. I did have a thought when I went to sleep last night. I was thinking, people dress up as all periods of history, but they don't seem to dress up as Tudors much. And I wonder why that is. Is it? And I think I'm going to start a society for the readoption of doublet and hose. And I want to see more of that at Chalke History next time. But I mean, there's just so much to do here. I'm really looking forward to the whole thing. Really.
I think that's a great answer. I think we should pitch it to James for next year.
Doublet and hose, yeah. Maybe he should open it wearing full rig. Yeah.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, now, you can tell him not me.
Well, now people are going to want to grab a copy of your book and interact with you online. How do they do that?
Well, it's available in all good bookshops. More Than a Game. It's published by John Murray. It's just out in paperback. So do go along and worry your local bookseller about it. Obviously, it's online as well.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on.